Why do people push boundaries? Is it because they're curious? Or maybe they're so interested in seeing something happen that they, well, like a mad scientist trying to experiment until something explodes or blows up, or going out into the sun without sunscreen and then they get burned, so on and so forth, right? It's one of these things where people don't understand until they feel some type of physical thing, because some people need to feel the physical in order to get it. So, you know, over time and in past videos, I talked about other things. Remind you, this is Finding Freedom. And freedom is, well, one that is not free. See, because there's always going to be sacrifice, right? Now, if you were to talk about different spiritual teachings, they talk about suffering, right? Or suffrage, or whatever the case may be. And life is about suffering. Well, if that be the case, well, then who created that part, right? Who made up that part, right? Because if you watch things like, I don't know, Star Trek or anything else that deals with things like that, or if you played StarCraft or anything else like that, you would understand that there was a galactic federation and they talked about communication. And when they talk about sacrifice and things like that, people will say, keep going, keep trying. Ooh, motivation, this, that, and the third. And if you want to figure out how someone or something or some species or entity is trying to survive, well, then you need to treat them like a guinea pig, put them in a maze, so on and so forth, and then figure out exactly how they survive and then replicate that for yourself, which is happening today, right? Because if you look at Pfizer has a veterinarian as a CEO that's supposed to be taking care of, well, human species, right? But they create medicine for them. So let's talk about certain things. So before we get into everything, within law, they also discuss this, as well as within critical thinking, that there's always a premise to the conclusion. So let me give you some context to the content that I'm about to deliver, and hopefully it is delivered sweetly so that nobody gets offended. But sometimes I may come with the passion of DMX or the spoken word of that well wishes to one day speak again, if I get to choose so, because, well, it really depends on what I want to say. Because if freedom of speech isn't free, then the FCC won't let me be. So let me be, so let me see. Because everybody wants to talk about things and they want to fight, but they do not want to communicate. And I guess they don't want anything that begins with the letter P, like peace, so on and so forth. So they continue the fighting, the chaos, and the animosity in order to go ahead and cause what? Catastrophe, fuel the fire, as they say, so on and so forth. But in Star Trek, there was an interesting episode that I was watching where they were sacrificing children in order for the greater good of the species on a colonized planet. And the captain didn't agree with this. However, it was their culture, it was their ideology, so on and so forth, right? And then, of course, well, there's a lot of people that like to keep secrets or call things out, so on and so forth. Like, ooh, I see the reflection. Yeah, sometimes I need a J, aka a journal, or maybe some Java for you coffee lovers out there. Why don't you jot something down and take some notes before you open your mouth and, well, not understand, because you like to push boundaries because you've been alive for a long time, but yet you still don't get it, right? Which I guess is why people, certain individuals, entities, spirits, souls, have to repeat the process, right? Start again and again and repeat, so on and so forth. If you've seen the movie A Knight's Tale, where they're trying to teach Heath Ledger how to dance, and Chaucer is teaching everybody, and somebody gets upset, he gets punched in the face, and then they continue with words, as well as trying to teach the gentleman how to dance, so on and so forth, so that he looks presentable in court. Now, during this time, there's a lot of people that will just test the boundaries, but then they don't know where the boundaries are. And then when the other side starts playing the game, they get all offended and frustrated and everything else, which I think is quite comical, right? Because everything, well, if it works in threes, why is there four? And what do I mean by this? In a courtroom, right, you have a prosecutor, a defendant, and then the judge, right? Now, if it goes further, you need a jury that begins with a J, by the way, so on and so forth. Don't ask me why, because a jury ends in Y, just like every day of the week, so on and so forth. So every day you should empty your cup instead of asking why, etc., or trying to figure it out because, well, you should have learned everything by now, but since you haven't, we'll continue, shall we? Because what is more important than life and the lessons learned that which you should understand already? See, in law enforcement, and when you say the Pledge of Allegiance, they say put your hand over your heart. But if you never studied anatomy, they could say your heart is on your left hand, on your left side, so on and so forth. So you'll put your badge over your heart, so on and so forth. Remember, cops used to be called copper because of the copper badge that they wore, etc. However, it also looks like a shield. And if you don't understand what I'm saying, this message is probably not for you. Now, why is that? Because everyone takes oaths, but some people like to skirt things or act a certain way, right? And so when you take certain oaths, right, whether you are in the military protecting people from foreigners and domestic, so on and so forth, etc., or you are in law enforcement protecting people domestically because they have been domesticated, but when they're exposed to the wild, they want to get wild, so you have to reinforce the laws or the rules, or aka the parameters, or the script that was put in place for you coders out there. Because, well, if the script is broken, then, well, the matrix won't work. So let's get into this. Now, when you are doing things, right, it's very interesting because they require now that some law enforcement, well, wear cameras at the center of their chest. They have their badge or their shield, so on and so forth. And then, of course, they put their hand over their heart or they salute to say, whatever to the flag. However, does it matter? Right? Because all I'm seeing is, well, stupidity happen over and over again, right? People want to talk about this, they want to talk about that. They don't care about spirituality, they want religion, right? They want to battle about religion, or they want to battle about politics, or they want to, well, have a war happen, so on and so forth, because they can't handle or use their words effectively or efficiently. So, the reason why this is because although many people have been around for a long time, when it comes to, well, intellect or understanding, it's very difficult because, well, if you are an intelligent person, then you already know, and the only reason you're carrying out an action, whether it's verbal, physical, or whatever, is because you want to test the boundaries to see what would happen, right? It's kind of like the people that cheat all the time, right? They want to test the boundaries to see if this person will still stay with me, or is the grass greener on the other side, or can I get away with cheating on the test, etc., not realizing everybody has a different test, and, well, that's what makes it unique, right? And if you are in business, well, of course there's competition, but there is always a unique selling proposition that, well, proposition begins with a P, but remember, spirituality, that's an S, but don't be stupid with this one because you too can be, well, I don't know, wait, unique starts with a U. So if I need to do this forwards or backwards, I will, because this is PSU, right? Not UPS. And I could go ahead and jumble these letters as much as I need to in order to get a point across, like EA Sports, it's in the game. But being that I'm a Marine, I have a EGA, and we're not going to talk about the ether, gravity, or the atmosphere, or I don't know, let's say the earth, ground, air, whatever, air, land, and sea, so on and so forth. Maybe some people cannot see what's in front of them and what they should be protecting, right? Because if you've seen the Netflix movie Heart of Stone, right, they talk about the heart being stolen, right? Well, whose heart, right? Everybody talks about spirituality, but since Christianity seems to be on the agenda right now, I'm going to just say, well, didn't God say that he was looking for a man after his own heart? Who stole your heart? Not who hurt you, but who stole your heart, right? Because if you are a believer in that thing, God, whatever, entity, universe, whatever, well, then you would be, well, in search of being someone that is after his own heart, being like such, so on and so forth. But then people want to test boundaries, right? And then when those boundaries get pushed a little bit too far, well, then things have to come back into perspective, get put back in frame so that people can see certain things because they don't understand what's here or what's being said. And they just want to play a game because they're like children. Thank God I went to the Marines because we are Uncle Sam's misguided children and we get taught differently. Yes? Because here's a little exercise, right? In order to use the bathroom, the latrine, the head, the porta-john, whatever, right? You have to slap your hand against a wooden board, state the proper thing, request permission to use the bathroom, and then hopefully they say yes. If not, they say try again. And then you slap the board again, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, you start to slap the board harder. And you have one or two choices before something occurs. You either get a yes, or you say, screw this and do it anyways, which is exactly what is happening now. See, you have people within the medical community, and I'll just call them out as well, that are, well, two-sided, so on and so forth. There are some that actually practice medicine, IM, internal medicine, right? That's an I and an M. But then there's others that want to play with the invisible, psychology. But then when you speak about spirituality, whatever freaking thing you believe in, right? They have an issue with it. So let me get this straight. You can talk about the invisible, you can talk about psychology and everything else, play with sociology and the psychological and sociological understandings that people have that which are, I don't know, being played with right now. But you're only showing your true intent to push the boundaries, right? And when those boundaries get pushed a little bit too far, as I stated earlier, well, there's a reason why when you go bowling, they have guardrails so you don't end up in the gutter, so on and so forth, for those of you who like to build roofs or clean gutters out there. And it's very interesting because I've seen people in the house say certain things and then they don't realize that it's a domino effect of, well, criticizing not just, well, religions, but, well, trying to enact the invisible, spirituality, etc., species alike, the Galactic Federation, Star Trek, Starcraft, etc., right? They want to see something happen. And then, of course, they'll say, Gabe, 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 and then they forget to read the other books, etc., and then not realize, oh, well, if Islam comes here, well, then that's going to hinder Christianity. And what then are you going to do, right? Because Gabriel is very dominant in the religion of Islam, which most people, I guess, they haven't read further, because just like the Harry Potter books, you're more than willing to entertain that because you're told it's a fantasy and a story, or Lord of the Rings because it's played upon, well, fantasy and story, but they're on Middle Earth, the thing that resides between heaven and hell, if we're using English terminology. And then if you want to go into Christianity and you want to talk about the movie Power, right? Well, there was James, and James took over the church from Jesus, right? His brother James, etc. And because the second normally gets everything according to spiritual teachings, I just checked this also with ChatGPT just to confirm what's being showed digitally is also reflected within text, right? Because you had Cain and Abel, Cain killed Abel, so on and so forth, and we all know how that went, right? So let's continue, because I don't think people put together class, which was creativity, logic, art, science, and spirituality. But from a militaristic context, it can also stand for coast, land, air, sea, and space, because some people don't understand the schoolhouse that we're in. So grammar school rock, let's get into it, right? Because not only is knowledge power, applied knowledge is power, AP. Right? applied knowledge, right? AP, that's advanced classes, right? So I take AP physics or AP whatever if you live in certain states, or advanced, right? Or how about piece up, A town down, so on and so forth. That's a PA, or AP backwards, but VA is Virginia, or Veteran Affairs, or a Veterans Alliance. So let's continue, because people like to play with chemistry sets like mad scientists, and then they don't understand the repercussions when they occur. And then they ask why, right? Oh, why did this happen? Why did that person have to die? Why did this go on, blah 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 blah. Why are people trying to extend their life, etc., and talk about NAD? Don't they believe in reincarnation? They can't wait their turn to come back. They want to keep repeating the process to see what happens throughout time. I mean, let's think about this, people, because if science fiction, abbreviated sci-fi, so on and so forth, and Greek mythology or Greek lettering, phi, right? Which would be what? Philosophy, or philosophy, phi, or pi, which rhymes with that, which is what? Two T's put together, 3.14, all for one, right? Because if you go backwards, it's 4, 1, period, 3, so on and so forth. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, judge, prosecutor, defendant, etc. The triangle and the 3 points, the chalice of an inverted triangle with the, I don't know, chevron or the tip of a spear that's inverted, putting it together, making a 6-pointed star. And then for you esoteric lovers out there, there's always a line to describe other elements. And if you put that together amongst the map of the United States, for those of you who like to peek over the shoulder every once in a while, you will understand what the heart of America is, or where it's located. So let's talk about this, right? Because let's talk about all the things that are going on, because people are pushing towards war. They want to see certain things occur and then backtrack and not, oh, I didn't mean that. What I meant to say was is that this person is this and that person is that. If you've ever seen the movie Legion, Gabriel comes down in the movie Legion and Michael breaks his collar and cuts off his wings, right? Because in scripture, right, whether you study Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, you have Michael and Gabriel. And Gabriel talks to Michael and he says, if you do this, this will be the last time that you upset him, so on and so forth, etc. And Gabriel is coming with the dogs of heaven, so on and so forth, the dogs of war, because God got fed up with all the species and he wanted to, well, in the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer, when they just wiped all the pieces off the board and said, where are the pieces now? Playing chess in the head now, right? Think of the chessboard as I speak about this, for those of you that understand what I'm saying, right? So, before you say you're okay, understand that there is 2 ways this could go about. Don't say 22 or 222, because that adds up to 6, first of all. And if you've ever been a Marine, wait one. Helicopter passing by. I don't know if that got picked up or not. Let me check the mic. We're live. All right, so if you study, well, let's say the commandments, thou shalt not murder or kill, or what about MK Ultra, or you've seen the movie Constantine, where Keanu Reeves' character, John Constantine, dictates that God and the devil made a couple rules, and they said you couldn't physically do anything to the creation, but you can influence, manipulate, deceive, or i.e., give a push for someone to do something and let them express their free will. However, when that gets combined with nefarious entities, actors, species, humans, creatures, whatever you call yourself these days, because I've seen a video of somebody identifying as a cat, all right, then you are not bending the rules, you are breaking the rules. Because if you are physically doing something to the body, whether it's through the invisible, psychology, psychiatrists, so on and so forth, or internally putting something in it, prescribing medications that have other side effects, not understanding how the world goes around because you can't keep a secret because you have two snakes that wrap around that face each other. And there's a reason why I guess there's wings at the top with a period, which I guess a baby actually comes from if it gets fertilized. So let's keep going, shall we? In Legion, Michael comes back to at least prove that there is a child that has hope, that can give hope to, well, before destruction happens and they just wipe the whole board, right? And in there, it is a baby that they're trying to protect, so on and so forth. And fast forwarding to the end of the movie, Gabriel is so, adamant about this. Remember, in the movie, the demons come out. There's an old lady in the diner, probably an old lady at a gas station acting out, and she was saying all these weird things, so on and so forth, eating her steak rare with flies on it. And it's the cannibals you have to worry about. That was in the book of Eli. So let's keep going. You know, Gabriel goes and he fights Michael, who doesn't have his abilities, right? So on and so forth. And Michael did everything he could to not only protect the child, etc., but he also dies in the movie, right? Then when he dies by Gabriel's hand, just before Gabriel is about to, well, kill the unborn child or the child that is there, whatever the case may be, that they were trying to protect, that would give hope for the success and the longevity of humanity instead of it, well, just being wiped off the face of the earth again, so on and so forth, like, well, the flood that gets repeated over and over again, whether that's Gilgamesh, Noah, or whatever the case may be. Michael gets his abilities back, comes down with his sword, and one blow, boom, attacks, but doesn't kill Gabriel. Why? Because thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not murder, MK Ultra, or whatever the case you want to use. And so, with this, y con esto que yo estoy diciendo en este momento, if you understand what I'm saying, then you would understand the context of the content that I'm being delivering to you, right? Because there's a lot of things that are going on, right? And so, that in that very last part of the movie Legion, right? If there's any Legionnaires out there, what's up? Gabriel looks at Michael and says, but why? How did you come back? You disobeyed him. And he looks at him and says, you gave him what he wanted. I gave him what he needed. He needed somebody to stand up in hopes that somebody would, well, be someone after his own heart, right? David, Goliath, etc., so on and so forth, right? And it wasn't just that, but he was going to kill an unborn child that has not been affected by the rules or the parameters that are in the world that which we live in on this plane, right? Now, let's see how things play out, because I was watching a TikTok video and it talked about 9/11 and how 11 relates to Saturn and Saturn's Lord of the Rings, right? And people talk about witchcraft and all these other things, but there's a difference between witchcraft and wizardry, right? The school of wizardry in Harry Potter, they were good. Witches are bad. If you've seen Mile 22, not Mission 22, Mile 22, right? And so, if you were to understand that and Lord of the Rings, right? Gandalf the Grey ended up coming back as Gandalf the White, so on and so forth, more powerful, etc. But there was a storyline within there, right? Because Frodo gave hope that there is some good in the world, and all the creatures that resided on the plane, whether they were from one side or the other, worked together, and it was essentially right and wrong, good and bad, dark versus light, think chessboard, black versus white, etc., right? Or a checkerboard, red versus black, etc., right? And then, of course, people get offended with certain things and they want to say this, that, and the third about people's sexuality. Question, are you sleeping with them? And if not, then why the hell does it bother you, right? You know, when I was younger, I used to sing a song and it'd be like men, 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 men in tights. And that came from the movie Robin Hood, right? That was a comedic twist to Robin Hood, right? Because they were wearing tights, so on and so forth. But if you are a thespian out there, you would understand that men normally also portrayed women because women were not acting at the time. This is a little historical, and I know, well, any that person that has an MD or a license to practice medicine that may not get it right, you can thank, well, Anthony Fauci for that one and Biden for pleading the fifth. Please hold your pencils or put them down, because I remember during an exam, there was one individual that looked at me that was a psychiatrist, and she goes, "Are we being tested right now?" Surprise. Anyways, if you look at, well, Hermeticism, right? Hermetic teachings, or the Scepter of Hermes, the catechist, which is on the, well, medical symbol, so on and so forth, at hospitals, but not the World Health Organization. That's the Asclepius. You would understand certain things because there are rules put in place in order to make sure that you preserve, heal, and protect life, right? The clue is in the title, health care, right? Heal them, but you don't need E and M to understand to heal them. Well, what's them, right? And then caring, which is what you're supposed to do, not being a Karen, so on and so forth, right? Remember in StarCraft, there was Kerrigan. Her mind got corrupted by the Zerg, etc. And Raynor had to, save her because he was also in love with her, but he had the help of the Protoss, who had advanced technology. Anyways, I digress. I continue because I have to give a premise to the conclusion of things that are currently playing out within media, right? The artificial intelligence videos, or the deep fake videos, and everything else that's going on, and people playing with subliminal messaging and advertising that's affecting people's, well, mental health, which is why it's so prevalent right now. See, you wouldn't be able to make money in the hospital system without it, right? And because of that, well, there's certain people that will say one thing and not the other, and then when things get questioned, they either don't know unless they have validation, proof, evidence. Otherwise, in a courtroom, for the attorneys and judges and arbiters out there, you understand what I'm dictating right now when it comes to presiding evidence in court. And depending on how I speak this, I'm just going to say this right now because it's a Latin term. What is it? Supra rosa, which means above the rose, right? Which means everything that I'm speaking about can come out into the light, as they say, or let's bring it to light, right? And so when it comes to that, right, let's speak upon it, because most people will go through life with certain understandings without questioning anything, and others will let others be and enjoy life. I remember I went to a movie theater and I just wanted to emphasize something while I was sitting next to someone, and I shined a light, a laser pointer, right? And it hit the person's shoulder and they quickly looked at me and I said, "How'd you know I was shining the laser pointer at you? Why'd you look at me?" So you do understand what I'm saying, right? I don't need to speak in other languages for you to understand the words coming out of my mouth, right? So, when it comes to, well, understanding all these things and the meaning of, well, life, chaos, destruction, etc. And then, of course, you have, other religions that believe in like a Leviathan, so on and so forth, or anaconda. My anaconda don't want none unless you got buns, hun. Let's talk about it, right? Because then there's the python, right? AP again, right? But anacondas and pythons live in the Amazon. And if you ever been to the Amazon because you study botany or geography, you would realize that's in Brazil. And if BRICS gets upset, right, and decides to go to war, well, then who's going to end up in a draft, right? And I'm not talking about a draft like Vietnam draft, etc. But who's going to end up fighting in the war? Who do you want standing next to you? Because a wise man once said, I'd rather be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. So if you read these spiritual books, right, if you go into the Quran, apparently Michael is in charge of, well, food and water, so on and so forth. In Christianity, he's a warrior, but now a warrior in a garden. Why is that, right? But then again, we also have other movies, right? Let's talk about Gladiator, right? Because there was a movie with John Travolta named Michael, and he was poor, broke, living with this older lady, so on and so forth, etc. It's a long story. Watch the movie, it's pretty good. But, you know, putting all these together, when it came to freedom of speech, right? There was a part in the movie Gladiator where Maximus Decimus Meridius was trying to not cause chaos, right? Still be respectful, but not cause chaos, even though the emperor at the time was the one who slaughtered his family and corrupted everything. And at one point, the emperor got upset. It's almost like the emperor has no clothes, right? And he says, why does the gladiator not remove his helmet and address me properly, right? Commanding, demanding respect. Okay, aquí manda yo. Whatever the case, whatever you want to say, whatever language you want to use, right? Because he was put in that position. See, most people will try to be dumb and say something like, oh, well, people are where they want to be. No, people are sometimes where they are placed or put by the powers that be. So, being that the gladiator, Maximus Decimus Meridius, was placed there and put in that position, right? It was very interesting because finally he said, screw it, removed his helmet, and not only addressed him, addressed the audience and all the cohorts and legionnaires and people in the audience, because you had the urban cohorts. If you ever played the game Rome or studied the cohorts that went in, the urban cohorts were like the special forces, the Navy SEALs, Delta, etc. of the Roman legion. And then of course you had legionnaires that were also soldiers and fighters within the military. Then you also had auxilia, etc. And he turns around, takes off his helmet and says, my name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander and general of the armies of the North, if I remember correctly. Father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife. And somewhere in there he says, whether in this life or the next, I promise you, I will have my vengeance. And they quickly do a formation around him, and his men come together, the other gladiators that were put into the arena to have his back. But then the crowd's eyes and the people listening woke up, right? They got woke, as they said, right? They woke up. They got woken up, right? Wake up, right? And all of a sudden they cheered for him to not be murdered or killed, but to be alive. And so the emperor had to give a thumbs up. For those of you that are on social media in this sociological experiment, you know, you can like or dislike on YouTube. You could give a thumbs up or thumbs down. And in Rome during the Colosseum in the times of the gladiator, the emperor or whomever was governor or in charge at the time of the territory or area would give a thumbs up or sideways or down, so on and so forth, right? To determine your life, pretty much, right? Kill him or leave him alive, or we'll let the jury decide. So I'm going to be neutral on this one. You guys decide. And then the crowd would cheer or the jury would chime in, because remember, in court, you have the judge that gives a ruling that slams the hammer down like Thor. And so then you have the attorneys that are in the courtroom, so on and so forth. But sometimes if it's high enough, whether it's a Supreme Court or not, you will also have either a jury or other people of your peers or similarity, etc. So understanding that he gets to live. And then eventually, if you've seen the movie, you know what happens. But when you start to put all the pieces of the different movies together, and then of course you have Star Trek and everything like that, why do they wear certain colors in Star Trek if we're not playing a psychological game? Right? Because a disc profile is also categorized with the colors red, blue, yellow, or gold, and green. And each color makes a reference to the disc profile. You know, if you're a driver, influencer, social, emotional, whatever the case may be, then you have the Myers-Briggs, which is just, well, the 16 personality types, which is 4 times 4. But then Jay-Z has the 444 album, and Biggie Smalls will say, I hit you with the 4-4, so on and so forth, right? But if the pen is mightier than the sword, well, is pen an acronym, or does it stand for pencil, or what? Or could it represent the protons, electrons, and neutrons in the atmosphere? It really depends on how your mind works. See, most people will say and make judgments based upon lack of understanding, assuming they know everything because they've been watching you since day one, hence the slang term day ones, right? And if you were a day one in the movie Gladiator, for instance, that's why everybody, well, was on Maximus's side, right? Because he was a great general and won many wars, so on and so forth. But then we have other movies, right? Like Game of Thrones, right? And in spirituality, you have principles, you have thrones, you have seraphim, and all these other things, right? But there was a blonde kid that got put into power, right? The Lannisters, if I remember correctly. And he killed the leader of the North, the father, right? And it was up to his children to avenge him, so on and so forth, right? And then you had Jon Snow, the bastard child, right, of the wolf, so on and so forth, who ended up also having Targaryen blood and lineage within him. Funny how that works because, well, the Targaryen that ended up, well, not only being in charge of the eunuchs and setting them free, but only to then get power put to her head, also controlling the dragon, ended up getting killed in the end, right? Because Jon Snow understood something that others did not. And I think that was the beauty of the movie, right? Or the series, etc., right? Because they say that true power corrupts, so on and so forth, or power can corrupt, or money can magnify people's intent. Now, if you ever seen the show Billions, obviously Bobby Axelrod is talking with Mark Cuban, and they're going against the government, and Mark tries to warn him. He's like, this isn't my first rodeo. I've been against the government before. And Bobby Axelrod, so, you know, nonchalantly and, well, how do I say this? Comedically says, what's the point in having fuck you money if you can't say fuck you every once in a while, right? And so this is where freedom of speech and finding freedom all come together, right? Because if you cannot have freedom with your words or understand that the football club, right, is trying to get you to understand how to use your words, right? Communicate, right? The FCC, right? But nobody likes soccer, so we'll call it football and we'll shape it differently. But the rest of the world plays football. However, a soccer ball is sometimes has different shapes on it, like a hexagon, right? Like a honeycomb shape, etc. It's weird how these things come together, especially if you saw the other video that came out the other day, or if you're watching this today, yesterday, so on and so forth, where I quote Bruce Lee. I said, don't think of an elephant and don't focus on the finger. Remember, Bruce Lee said, it's like the finger that points to the moon. Don't concentrate on the finger or you will miss all the heavenly glory, right? Now, some people may have loose justifications, right? But if they have loose justifications, or let's say they're atheists or whatever the case may be, they don't believe in any of that stuff. Let's talk about Avengers. Because in Avengers, Thor is actually explaining stuff to other people. And remind you, I also mentioned Star Trek, which has different species. Avengers has different species. They get along sometimes, etc. There's always conflict, right? But he does something very interesting. And when he calls his hammer and does other things, they're like, oh my God, you have magic powers. And he said, anything that has not been explained or described to one as such will have magic look indistinguishable from science. On your planet or plane, it may be called magic. In other places, such as Thor's, it's called science, right? And so it was very interesting, right? Because it all links together. See, as a magician for more than 20 years, you can see when somebody is doing an effect very skillfully, right? And now you have Penn and Teller's, what is it? FU, fool us, right? FU, fool us, right? And then the magicians go on there and they try to fool Penn and Teller, etc. There was a gentleman named Caleb who did the chicken and the egg trick, so on and so forth. He ended up winning an award. He wore a blue suit, if I remember this correctly. And long story short, I think he turned a fake egg or made an egg appear, and then it was a real egg, and then the egg ended up being whatever. Long story short, they made a joke about the chicken and the egg, and he also stated something back and forth to Penn and Teller as he was on stage. And I think it was Penn that stated, well, he really got us with the chicken or the egg because we don't know which came first, which was interesting, right? Because I'm connecting these puzzle pieces for different individuals, right? Like a friend of mine named Scott, right? Um, it was very peculiar how certain things played out, but because of the world that which we live in, we have movies and stories and books to try to get a point across, like the movie Now You See Me. And there's a third one coming out, which I cannot wait for because it's going to be very interesting. I think the gentleman that played Mark Zuckerberg, who created Facebook, aka Meta. So if this is too meta for you, get out of this universe, or this space, or go to a different video, so on and so forth, or stay within this and try to understand because, well, there's coding and logic within the matrix, right? But then again, if you look at the coding within the movie The Matrix and watch the movie Stargate, along with a couple other things, you can see certain characters, commas, symbols, etc., that reflect one another. So getting back to it, one thing might look like magic, the other thing might look like science if you are in the know, right? It's kind of like pen, right? If pen is mightier than the sword, right? And pen would be an acronym for protons, electrons, and neutrons, which is in atoms, so on and so forth. Oh, wait, atom was in the Bible, right? Depending on how you enunciate or pronunciate it. So what was first, the atom or the cell? Well, that depends. Has your mind been imprisoned? Because if so, then you are locked in a cell, right? With other things, right? And a cell contains a lot of different things, right? The mitochondrion, all these other things, a nucleus. And it's just weird how everything is, well, astrological because of, well, as I stated earlier in the video, you have Saturn, 9/11, and then they point out the 11, the Twin Towers, if I remember correctly, that came down. Then they also hit the Pentagon, if I remember correctly, right? 2 towers, and then a third building, so that's 3. Baseball reference, 3 strikes, you're out, right? Or the 11 that would represent Saturn, but if you break that up, right? Sat, right? And then, of course, all those people died, and where do you put ashes but in a urn, right? So we need to speed up here because most people say slow down. However, you don't mess with certain individuals when they're trying to maintain their peace because you want to see how everything plays out, or you're trying to maintain a PC like mind. In other words, have power and control. Why do I state this? Well, if you were to look at my phone, I have different wallpapers, right? And one of the wallpapers, or two of them, I should say, have Assassin's Creed symbol, right? Which can kind of look like the square and compass, but then, of course, it almost represents it, right? Because the Assassin's Creed symbol has an arch underneath it and then a strict triangle, right? Because if you were to study stone masonry, the arched ways can handle longer periods of time than rigid structures just due to the, well, weight distribution and everything else, because everything over time breaks down. So how do you make sure that there is a little bit of flex within it in order to last longer? I guess this is why they say you should stretch the body, because if not, well, then it will become rigid and brittle if you do not move it, right? This is why I guess people have knees that are sometimes bad, because they don't like to use them, and the knees are not used to impact or flexing, etc., or stretching. So they get injuries within the tendons and ligaments that help them flex, rotate, and pivot, etc. Right? So all this to say that more people should either read more books, do better research, or understand certain things, right? Because you have to understand, they may fight over males and females or men and women, but if you could look closely at this book that says mastery on it with an M symbol, I think I got this from a Tony Robbins event, right? If I were to turn this upside down, right, that M symbol quickly becomes a W. And if you were to ever use a latrine, a restroom, a bathroom, how you do identify? Well, how does anyone identify? Well, we're going to give you a stick figure, so on and so forth, and then we're going to put M or W, and then you could go ahead and figure it out from there. And if you put the M and W together, well, it looks like a wavelength or a frequency, that which science and physics and engineers know and discuss, yes or yes. So for those of you that are either attorneys, engineers, practitioners of spirituality, please by all means leave a comment. And before something crazy happens, because people are just wanting something to happen, remember the Olympics that everybody got upset about because of the Last Supper, but never realized that it was a character from Assassin's Creed that lit the torch. So, till next time, my friends, take care, God bless. And by the way, if you ever played Assassin's Creed, remember, in Assassin's Creed, the Templars wanted power and control. The others, they protected free will and freedom. So I'll see you on the next episode of Finding Freedom. Adios.